Emily Dimmock is standing in her room at 29 St. Paul's Road on the morning of Wednesday, the 11th of September, 1907, holding a letter in one hand and a postcard in the other, telling a man named Roberts that she thinks they were written by the same person. Then she puts the letter in the fireplace and burns it. That is where this story begins. Not with the discovery, not with the investigation, but with that small, deliberate act. A young woman, 23 years old, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Good evening and welcome. There will be no sudden sounds here, no raised voices, nothing to startle you from rest. If you find comfort in these stories and wish to follow us, please do. Close your eyes whenever you wish. Let your breathing slow. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Her name was Emily. Emily Elizabeth Dimmock. Her friends called her Phyllis. And I think that matters. Phyllis was the name she chose for herself, the name she moved through her days with, the name that fit the life she had built rather than the one she had been given. She was 23 years old in the autumn of 1907, living in a ground-floor room in Camden Town with her partner, a railway man called Bert, and managing a life that required her to be several things at once, sometimes in the same hour. I want to stay with that for a moment. Emily, who called herself Phyllis, has been written about, mostly in terms of how she died and who might have killed her. The trial that followed her death ran for days and drew crowds, and was reported as far away as Melbourne. Her name is in crime histories, on historical websites, in academic essays about Edwardian London and the treatment of women by the press and the courts. But in almost none of that record does she get to speak for herself. There are no letters in her handwriting, no diary, no words from her that survive the morning of the 11th of September. Everything we know about her comes through other people, which is exactly why I want us to begin with her, and not with them, and not with the investigation, and not with the man who was tried and acquitted. With her, with what we can piece together about who she was. She was young, and she was capable, and she was navigating a life that asked a great deal of her. She shared a room with Bert Shaw at 29 St. Paul's Road, a modest lodging house in the working-class streets near King's Cross. The room served as both their bedroom and their sitting room. There would have been a bed, a fireplace, a few chairs, the ordinary furniture of a life lived in rented rooms in early 20th-century London. Gaslight rather than electric, coal in the grate, the smell of the city coming in when you open the window. Emily supplemented the household income through sex work. She met clients at local public houses, including the Eagle on Royal College Street, a short walk from the house. I'm going to be plain about this, the way I'd want someone to be plain if they were telling a story about a person I cared about, because the alternative is to use the kind of careful language that puts distance between Emily and the listener, and that's not what she deserves. She was a young woman doing what she needed to do to get by in a city where getting by was hard, and the nature of her work made her vulnerable to judgment, to harassment, to the removal of credibility, in ways that mattered enormously to what happened after she died. But it didn't make her less of a person. It made her a person under more pressure than most. What Bert knew, or chose to know, about the full shape of Emily's evenings, the sources don't say. He worked long hours, irregular shifts, the kind of railwayman's schedule that had him away overnight more than he was home. Their domestic arrangement had a texture to it, a kind of ordinary rhythm, she at home or out during his shifts, he returning to find the kettle on or the room empty. The everyday mechanics of a shared life. And in that sense, Emily was also a partner, a tenant, a regular at the local pub, a neighbor behind a shared wall. She was all of those things, and more, and she made her own choices and had her own reasons, and kept some things private, the way all people do. Which brings us back to the morning of the 11th of September, and to the letter. Someone had sent Emily both a letter and a postcard. The postcard, we'd learn later, arranged a meeting at the Eagle. The letter, she told Roberts, seemed to have been written by the same hand. She showed them both to him. She compared the writing. She made an observation and shared it, deliberately and calmly, and then she put the letter in the fireplace and burned it. Roberts watched her do it. He saw the letter go into the grate, and he saw it catch, and he watched it become ash. He didn't stop her. Maybe it didn't occur to him that he should. Maybe she didn't give him the impression she was doing anything unusual. People burned letters in 1907. Paper was disposed of in fireplaces. It was an ordinary act on the surface of it. But she kept the postcard. That's the detail that stays with me, and I think it should stay with you too, just gently, in the background of everything that follows. She made a distinction. The letter went into the fire. The postcard stayed. She had a reason, or reasons, that we can't recover now and we never will be able to. But she made that choice herself, on her last morning, with full deliberateness. The mystery at the heart of this story begins not with a locked door or a disordered bed, but with Emily standing at her fireplace, deciding what to keep and what to let go. The day was September, early autumn in London. The light would have been cool and pale through the windows of the ground-floor room. The smell of burnt paper in the air, a thread of smoke from the grate. Roberts was there. Emily was there. The morning was still going on around them, the street outside, the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood. And Emily was already into the last hours of her ordinary life, though nothing in the room gave any sign of that yet. She had plans for the evening. The postcard had seen to that. Chapter 2. To understand what Emily's evenings look like, you have to understand what her days look like. And to understand her days, you have to understand Bert. Bertram Shaw, who everyone called Bert, was a good and steady man in the way that working-class men of 1907 tended to be when they were good and steady, which is to say he had regular employment, modest wages, and a reliable place in the world he occupied. He worked for the railways, the expanding web of lines that ran in and out of King's Cross and the other great London termini, and his hours were the kind that don't accommodate a tidy domestic life. He'd be off at odd times, away for stretches, back at hours when Emily might or might not be home. The relationship they had was built around those gaps, the way relationships always are when one person's work creates a lot of absence. I don't think we should make too much of what Bert knew or didn't know. The record doesn't give us his private thoughts, and it wouldn't be right to fill in that silence with guesses that serve the story more than they serve him. What we can say is that he came home to Emily, and she was there when he came home, and they shared that small room in Camden with its fireplace and its gaslight, and whatever complications existed in the rest of their arrangement, the domestic core of it was real. He was her partner. She was his. The Eagle on Royal College Street was about a 10-minute walk from their house, depending on how fast you walked and how many people you stopped to talk to on the way. It was a pub in the way that Edwardian London pubs were pubs, warm and crowded and loud, smelling of beer and tobacco, and the damp wool of coats brought in from the street. It was a social space and a working space for Emily, somewhere she could sit and talk and meet the men who became her clients, somewhere she was known, somewhere the regulars knew her face and her name. Or rather, the name she used. Phyllis. This is worth thinking about for a moment. Emily chose to be Phyllis in these spaces. It's a form of self-protection, maybe, or a way of keeping things sorted in her own mind. The life at home and the life at the Eagle running on parallel tracks under different names. A lot of people in fragile situations develop that kind of architecture. You learn which version of yourself to present where, and you keep the tracks from crossing when you can. Emily was good at managing things. The act of burning the letter carefully after comparing it to the postcard, after sharing her observation with Roberts, suggests a person who paid attention to detail, who kept track of things, who made decisions rather than simply letting events happen to her. The postcard that arrived had asked her to meet at the Eagle. That was the plan for the evening of the 11th. She'd done this before, met someone at the pub who'd sent her a note. It was part of how the arrangement worked. The pub as meeting place, the return home afterward, the transaction and whatever conversation surrounded it, the man leaving before morning, a familiar shape to the evening. Nothing about the plan itself was unusual. And this is where I want to be careful and honest about what we can and can't know. Emily's evenings at the Eagle weren't dangerous in the way people might now assume. She knew the space and the people in it. She made judgments about who to spend time with. She had presumably a sense of who was safe and who wasn't, built up over time. The particular danger of the evening of the 11th of September wasn't visible in advance, not to her, not to Roberts, not to Bert, who was away at work. It looked like any other evening, which is one of the quiet griefs at the center of this story. The neighborhood around St. Paul's Road had its own texture, its own population. Lodging houses like the one at number 29 meant walls between tenants were thin and lives overlapped whether people wanted them to or not. Neighbors heard things. Neighbors saw things. Neighbors would be called upon, later, to say what they had or hadn't noticed. The street outside had its ordinary sounds, carts and footsteps and the distant rumble of railway traffic, the constant underhum of a city getting on with itself. Inside the ground floor room, the sounds were more personal. A kettle, a door, two people talking, the ordinary interior of a shared life. I keep coming back to Emily in that room because I think it's important that we hold the image of her there, in her space, before it became a crime scene, before it became a place people examined for evidence. It was her home. The fireplace was her fireplace. The bed was her bed. She'd made choices about where to put things and how to arrange the few possessions that made up her domestic world. And on the morning of the 11th, she stood at that fireplace and burned a letter, and then the day went on, the way days do, and evening came. Roberts was someone in Emily's circle, an acquaintance who knew her well enough that she'd shown him the letter and the postcard that morning, trusted him enough to share her observation about the handwriting. He saw what he saw, and later he would be asked to say what he had seen, and his testimony would become one of the fixed points around which the investigation and the trial turned. He had his own interest in the outcome of all that, as we'll get to. But that morning he was simply there, watching her burn a letter, in a room that still smelled of coal smoke and the ordinary autumn morning. The postcard was still on the table, or in her pocket, or somewhere close. It had arranged her evening. She was going to the Eagle. The man who'd written the card might be there, or might not, and she'd navigate whatever came. That was the shape of what was ahead. And Bert was at work, somewhere in the city's web of railway lines, doing his job, unaware that by the time he came home again, the door to their room would be locked from the inside, and everything would have changed. Chapter 3. The evening of Wednesday the 11th of September came in the way that early autumn evenings in London do, the light going early, the air cooling, the city drawing inward toward its warmth and its noise and its lit windows. Emily went to the Eagle. I want to narrate the evening as she would have experienced it, to the extent that I can, because she deserves that, and because the alternative, laying out a timeline of investigative reconstruction, feels like it serves the case more than it serves her. So, she walked to Royal College Street. She went into the pub. The light inside would have been yellowish and warm, gas mantles on the walls, the smell of the place hitting you as you came in from the cold, beer and tobacco and bodies and conversation. She was known there. She settled in. The man she met that evening, the man she left with, is the person the whole investigation would circle around for weeks. His identity at the time was uncertain. What isn't uncertain is that Emily left the Eagle with a man, walked home to 29 St. Paul's Road, let herself in, and went to bed. She apparently fell asleep. This is what the evidence suggests, and it matters because it means the end was not frightening in the way an end might be. She went to sleep in her own bed, in her own room, in the home she shared with Bert, and she didn't wake up again. I won't say more than that about what happened next, because more than that isn't necessary, and I don't think it would serve Emily to describe it in detail. What the medical evidence would later confirm is that death was almost instantaneous, and that she wouldn't have been conscious of it. I hold on to that, the little comfort it offers, and I offer it to you. The man left before morning. The room went quiet. The street outside went quiet too, the way streets do in the small hours. Just the occasional footstep or distant rumble, the city breathing through its sleep. The burnt ash of the letter was in the grate. The postcard was, presumably, still in the room. The bedclothes were disordered. The blood had spread, slowly and steadily, in the way that blood does when nothing is moving to stop it. The fender of the fireplace was not far enough away. By morning the blood had reached nearly to it, pooled and darkened in the gap between the bed and the hearth. Nobody came in. The door was locked. Thursday, the 12th of September. The daytime hours passed. Whatever neighbors heard through the shared walls, if they heard anything unusual at all, they either didn't act on it or didn't later recall anything that would help. The room behind the locked door held its silence. Bert came home in the evening. He arrived at 29 St. Paul's Road after his shift, in that particular frame of mind that you're in when you've been working long hours and you're tired and you want to get through your own front door, and he found the bedroom door locked, and that wasn't right. It wasn't usual. He would have knocked, probably. He would have tried the handle again. He would have called her name, Emily or Phyllis or whatever name he used for her when he called through a door. And nothing came back. He got help. Someone from the house, a neighbor, another tenant. The record doesn't specify exactly, but the door was forced open. And when it swung open, there was the room and the bed, and what looked, in the first instant, like a heap of clothes on top of it. The divisional surgeon was called. He came to the room, and he looked at the heap of clothes, and then he looked again, and he understood what he was looking at. He noted, in his professional account, the bedclothes in great disorder, saturated with blood, a stream of blood on the floor reaching nearly to the fender. Emily's body beneath the clothes, a bolster placed lengthwise behind her, naked, still. He noted that death had been almost instantaneous, that the wound could not have been self-inflicted, that a third party had been responsible. He noted the state of the room, the disorder of the fireplace with its ash. In the grate, among the ash and the cinders, there were burnt remnants of paper. The letter Emily had burned that morning. The letter she had held and read and compared to the postcard and then deliberately destroyed. It was ash now, charred at the edges, the words on it gone. Whatever it had said, whatever it had arranged or invited or pleaded or threatened, was lost in the 12 hours between Emily standing at the fireplace and the surgeon crouching to look at the grate. And that's the thread I told you about at the beginning, the letter she burned. There it is again, in the ash, while the surgeon stands in the room and the investigation begins to assemble itself around the space where Emily used to live. The police arrived, the room was photographed and examined, witnesses were sought. The locked door, the disordered bed, the blood on the floor, the burnt paper in the grate, all of it became evidence, became recorded, became part of the official account of what had happened to Emily Dimmock on the night of the 11th of September, 1907. Her home became a crime scene. Her private space became a place people moved through with authority, looking for what could be found. The postcard was still there. or it came to light shortly afterward among the things in the room. It would be the one piece of communication from whoever had written to her that survived, the one she had chosen to keep, and it would eventually lead the investigation somewhere specific. But we're not there yet. On the evening of the 12th, the immediate task was simpler and sadder. Bert had come home to find Emily dead, the divisional surgeon had confirmed it, and the police were beginning to ask their questions. The investigation had started. The private world of 29 St. Paul's Road was no longer private. Chapter 4. The investigation moved through the familiar steps that investigations of that era followed. Witnesses, public houses, acquaintances, testimony. The Eagle was canvassed. People who had been there on the evening of the 11th were asked what they had seen. The staff were questioned. Other patrons were sought out. Slowly, a picture assembled of Emily's last evening, who she'd been with, when she'd left, which direction she'd walked. And then there was the postcard. It had been sent to Emily. The handwriting on it was distinctive, not illegible or ordinary, but with a particular quality to it, the kind of handwriting that people who know someone's hand can recognize at a distance. The police began to ask around. Witnesses who had seen Emily in the days before her death were shown the card. Someone who knew the handwriting was what they needed. And eventually, through the shape of how investigations move, the card made its way to someone who recognized it immediately. Her name was Ruby Young. She had been Robert Wood's lover, or had been at one time, their relationship by September 1907 in the past rather than the present. But the connection was still there, the kind of familiarity that doesn't disappear just because the relationship does. And when Ruby saw the postcard, she knew whose handwriting it was. She knew because she had received letters in that hand herself. She knew the way you know, with a certainty that doesn't require analysis or comparison charts. She just knew. I want to stay with Ruby for a moment, because what happened next required something of her that most people hope they'll never be asked to give. She went to Robert Wood. She confronted him. She had his handwriting in her hand, effectively, the evidence that connected him to Emily Dimmock, to a meeting at the Eagle, to the postcard found in a dead woman's room. And Wood, facing this, didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain it away. He begged her not to say anything. He suggested what she should say if anyone asked, that they had been in the habit of meeting regularly, a cover story that would normalize his connection to the Eagle and make his presence there less remarkable, less pointed. He was afraid, that's clear enough. What's less clear is what exactly he was afraid of. He would later say, after his arrest, that he hadn't wanted to be associated with certain establishments, with certain witnesses, with the parts of Edwardian social life that respectable people weren't supposed to frequent. He was an artist and designer, a man of a certain bohemian but still reputation-conscious position. Being linked to Emily Dimmock, to her world, to the pub where she worked, felt dangerous to him, in the social sense, before it became dangerous in the legal sense. He wanted his name kept out of it. He was, he would insist, thinking about his reputation, not concealing guilt. Ruby listened to all of that, and then she made her choice. She didn't lie for him. She went to the police. I've thought about this a lot, sitting with this story, and I keep coming back to how hard that must have been. Not because she owed him protection. She didn't. And what he was asking her to do was ask her to lie to a murder investigation. But because the person asking was someone she had been close to, someone whose face and handwriting and way of being in the world were familiar to her in the way only intimacy makes familiar. He was appealing to something real, the history between them, the fact that she knew him. And she weighed it, and she chose the truth instead. Wood was arrested on the 4th of October, 1907. He had been sought and found, the false alibi he had tried to construct crumbling against the weight of what Ruby had told the police. He was charged with the murder of Emily Dimmock. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in December of that year, and it drew the kind of attention that trials drew in the Edwardian period. People following the newspapers, crowds wanting the updates, a sense that the nation was watching a story resolve itself in a courtroom in London. The coverage was intense. Some of it came from as far away as Australia, where newspapers reported on the proceedings, as though the readers there would naturally understand the significance of a Camden Town murder trial. The prosecution rested on 5 main points. First, that Wood had an intimate relationship with Emily. Second, that he had written the letter that invited her to meet on the night she died. Third, that he had authored the postcard arranging the earlier meeting at the Eagle. Fourth, that he had been seen with her at the pub on the evening of the 11th. Fifth, that he had been seen leaving her house at around 4:45 in the morning of the 12th. Each of these points was presented, argued, examined, and in some cases disputed. The defense was led by Sir Edward Marshall Hall, a man known for his effectiveness in court, for his ability to cross-examine in a way that left witnesses uncertain about what they had seen or heard or remembered. Marshall Hall believed Wood was innocent. He would say later that he thought the case was finely balanced, which was a rare admission from a man who tended toward certainty. But he did believe in his client, and he worked accordingly. The handwriting evidence was contested. The alibi evidence was contested. The sighting of Wood near the house in the early hours was contested. The nature of his relationship with Emily was contested. Point by point, Marshall Hall went after the prosecution's case, finding its edges, testing its certainties, holding each claim up to the light of what could actually be proved. The judge, Mr. Justice Grantham, was expected by many observers to lean toward conviction, but his summing up surprised them. He indicated that, in his view, the prosecution had not proved its case, that the evidence was largely circumstantial, that the jury should bear in mind what had and hadn't been established, and the jury went out, and they came back, and they had been gone for about 15 minutes. Not guilty. Robert Wood walked out of the Old Bailey on a December day in 1907, acquitted, the crowd pressing in around him, the newspapers already preparing their accounts of the verdict. He was free. Emily was still dead. Her killer was still unknown. The case was, in the legal sense, closed. In every other sense, it was not. Chapter 5. There's a quality to the aftermath of an acquittal in a murder case, where the accused person is the only named suspect, that I find particularly hard to sit with. It isn't that an acquittal is wrong. The jury heard what was presented and found it insufficient to convict, and given how little physical evidence existed, given how much depended on witness testimony and handwriting comparison, and the uncertain science of what anyone saw at what time in the early hours of a September morning, that is entirely comprehensible. I'm not here to overturn the verdict or to argue that Wood should have been convicted, but what the verdict meant, in practical terms, was that Emily's death went unanswered. Nobody was held responsible. The case was unresolved, and has remained unresolved for more than 100 years. So where does that leave us, sitting here with the question? The theories are honest about their own limits, which is the right starting point. The case against Wood rests on the handwriting, the connection to Emily, his presence at the Eagle, the witness who said she saw someone near the house in the early hours, and it rests on the false alibi, which is the thing that's hardest to explain away cleanly. Wood constructed a story about where he'd been and asked Ruby to support it. That's not what innocent people typically do. Innocent people, when told there's been a murder and the police might be interested in where they were, usually just tell the truth about where they were, even if where they were is somewhere a little embarrassing. The effort to construct a different account, to coach a former lover in what to say, suggests someone who was frightened in a particular way. Not just the general social fear he later described, but the specific, pressing fear of someone who knows their actual movements wouldn't look good. And yet, the physical evidence connecting him to the room was absent. The timing of the false alibi was complicated, pointing to a time before the estimated time of death, which complicated the prosecution's own narrative. The case was circumstantial, and honest engagement with it has to acknowledge that circumstantial isn't the same as conclusive. Could it have been someone else? The name Roberts comes up in some accounts. Not with much force, but with enough to note. Roberts, who saw Emily burn the letter, who testified at the trial, who had, according to some observers, his own reasons to want a conviction that wasn't him. If Wood were acquitted, Roberts knew he might become a logical alternative focus. His motive for wanting Wood convicted was real. But the evidence against Roberts is thinner than the evidence against Wood, and pressing that theory harder than the record supports would be doing Emily a disservice. It would be substituting one set of inadequate answers for another. The truth is that we don't know who killed her. The investigation ran for weeks. The trial ran for days, and at the end of it, the answer was not found. The forensic methods of 1907 were what they were, dependent on witnesses and handwriting, and the reconstruction of movements through memory rather than evidence that could speak for itself. The limits of the investigation weren't failures of care or intelligence, they were the limits of what was possible then. The press covered the case with the characteristic sensationalism of the period. Emily's occupation was raised constantly, not in service of understanding her, but in service of framing the moral geography of the case. She was presented as a figure of pity tinged with reproach, a young woman who had put herself in a certain kind of danger by living a certain kind of life. The trial's discussion of her credibility, her respectability, her worth as a figure of concern ran along those lines. What she had been, in those accounts, mattered more to the writers than who she had been. Her inner life wasn't the question anyone thought to ask. And I find that the most persistent sadness in this story, not just that she died and nobody was held accountable, though that is genuinely sad, but that the record of her death is almost entirely composed of other people's versions of her. Robert's testimony, Bert's distress, Wood's account of their acquaintance, the surgeon's clinical description, the press's moral framing, even the investigation, thorough and careful as it seems to have been, was assembling a picture of her movements rather than a picture of her. She had a name she chose for herself. She had a fireplace she stood at on a September morning and made a deliberate decision. She had a partner she came home to. She had evenings she navigated with skill and judgment. She had reasons for everything she did that we can't reach now because she left no words in her own hand, and everything that might have told us is ash in a grate that was cleared out 117 years ago. Chapter 6. I want to come back to Emily now, away from the theories, away from the trial, away from the newspaper accounts and the legal proceedings. Back to her. She was 23 years old, which is younger than it sounds when you've been turning it over. 23 is very young to be managing the kind of life she was managing. The domestic reality of a shared lodging room, the economic pressure of supplementing Bert's wages in the only way that was available to her, the careful architecture of different names and different spaces and different versions of herself held in place simultaneously. That requires a kind of daily competence and attention that doesn't get much acknowledgement, because it's the competence of survival rather than the competence of achievement, and survival rarely gets noticed until it stops. She paid attention to handwriting. She noticed that morning that the letter and the postcard seemed to come from the same person. She thought it was worth saying out loud. She made a judgment about what to keep and what to destroy. She was, in that moment, exercising a kind of careful reasoning that the subsequent story mostly ignored. I wonder what she thought about, standing at the fireplace while the letter caught, whether she was frightened of something, or cautious, or whether it was simply a practical decision with no particular weight behind it, whether she had a feeling, that morning, that something wasn't right, or whether the day seemed ordinary, the way last days so often do. She had plans for the evening. She was going to the Eagle. She'd done it before, she'd do it again. Except she didn't. We have no grave for Emily that the record names, no memorial, no words she wrote that survived her. What we have is her name in the records, in the trial transcripts and the newspaper archives, and the summaries written by historians who thought her story was worth preserving. We have her name, Emily Elizabeth Dimmock, who called herself Phyllis, who was 23 years old, who stood at a fireplace on a September morning and made a choice, and who did not come home from the evening that followed. And we have the building. Chapter 7. Agar Grove is the name of the street now. It used to be St. Paul's Road, before the city rearranged itself and changed what things were called, the way cities do. But the street is still there. The building that was once 29 St. Paul's Road is still standing. Ordinary brickwork, ordinary windows, a front door that faces an ordinary Camden Street. It's been there for more than 100 years. The room that Emily and Bert shared is behind one of those windows, a ground floor window at the front of the building. And from the outside, there's nothing to mark it, nothing to say that anything of consequence ever happened inside. Traffic passes. People walk by without looking up. They're going where they're going, the way people always are, and the building is just a building, which is what buildings are when enough time has gone by. The brickwork holds its silence. The window lets in the same gray London light it has always let in. September comes around every year, and the 11th of it comes around too, and the street doesn't pause, because streets don't. I've been sitting with Emily's story for a while now, and what I keep coming back to is how much of her is missing. Not just from the record, though that's true, but from the way the story has been told. She's been described, in most accounts, in terms of her relationship to the crime, the victim, the woman whose death set off the investigation, the woman in the room. What she was before that room, who she was in the quiet parts of her day, what she hoped for and feared and thought about when she was walking to the Eagle on a September evening, those things belong to the silence. We can't get to them. The letter is ash. But her name is still there. Emily, Phyllis, 23 years old. A person who made deliberate choices and paid attention to details and managed a difficult life with more skill than she ever got credit for. I think it matters that we say her name, clearly and without the framings that the press and the trial and the years put around it. Emily Elizabeth Dimmock. That's who we've been spending the evening with. The building on Agar Grove doesn't know that. The brickwork doesn't carry it. But you do now, if you've been here with me through all of this. You know something about who she was, however incomplete that something has to be. You've heard her name said with care. I hope that's worth something. She deserved more than what she got from the world and from the record it kept of her. She deserved her own words to survive her. She deserved the kind of account that didn't depend on other people's testimony about her movements to reconstruct even the outline of a person. She deserved, most simply, to walk home from the Eagle on the night of the 11th of September, 1907, and go to sleep in her own bed and wake up in the morning. She didn't get any of that, but she gets this. A quiet hour in which she is at the center of her own story, and the trial and the verdict and the theories orbit her rather than the other way around. An evening in which someone says her name carefully. Emily, Phyllis, 23. The street outside the building on Agar Grove is quiet tonight, or as quiet as London streets ever are. The ground floor window is dark. The city breathes around it the way it always has, indifferent and enormous and going on. Thank you for spending this evening here with me and with Emily. I hope you're comfortable, and I hope you find rest. Rest well. A peaceful night to you.